Hello, and welcome to another episode from Restoring the Right Hand. We have another presentation for you. We hope you will be blessed. Today, we're actually going to talk about the pharmaceutical industry, corruption, part one. So this is a fascinating topic because this affects everything that is going on right now. And what we want to do is we want to step back and look at it from a broad perspective. There's a lot of things that have been written about the corruption, which are legendary. We're only going to cover a couple things and help us to understand and evaluate the things that we're seeing today. So one of the things that I just want to mention is that you can always sign up for our newsletter so you keep in touch with us at our website here. We will be posting other videos on our website, so this is a great way to follow it. We also recommend that you check out our YouTube channel. This video in particular will be pushed or published on YouTube. However, there's going to be at least a part two, perhaps a part three that will only be able to be published on Rumble. So if you can, please subscribe to us on YouTube and definitely subscribe to us on Rumble because there's going to be some content on there that may be too hot for YouTube. Now, we want to go ahead and start this. If we go back in time to 1901, you can see probably since the history of medical journals, there's always been some sort of, how would I put it, pay for play type of scenario where drug companies will advertise in the journal to get a favorable review of the products. And if you look here, this is in 1901, the St. Louis Medical Era. And this is a medical journal, and you can look and see the article by Dr. P. Zimmerman. And this is about the therapeutics of aspirin. And what's fascinating about this article is that he talks about how great it is and what it does. And indeed, it may be great for those people. I don't know, not concerned about that. But what is interesting is this, is sure enough, there were advertisements in here. And here's a snippet from one of the advertisements. And you can see, indeed, Bayer is advertising the use of aspirin. I don't think that is simply coincidence that a giant company like Bayer figured out early on in the history of medical journals to make sure they advertised there while there was articles written about the effectiveness of their product. You can see here, again, another advertisement, but I like the red arrow here. You can see in the green arrow that it's pointing to aspirin, but I like the red arrow because Bayer apparently didn't just make aspirin, it made a whole host of other drugs. I'm not even sure what all these other ones are, but I do recognize the one by the red arrow, which is heroin hydrochloride. So you got to think about that even then they were pushing this idea of using poison to make people well. And this is 1901 Medical Journal. There's other ones that you would be well aware of, but this is just a sample. This is actually one of my favorites. This is actually a picture. This was taken. This was put into Medscape, and this is an actual picture of Philip Morris. They were promoting being able to give cigarettes at the American Medical Association. So here's a nurse. She may not even be a nurse, just maybe a rep dressed up, and they were handing out cigarettes to the members of the American Medical Association, which is kind of hilarious when you think about it. That here they are doing that and handing it out. And then you begin to wonder, well, is this why we begin to see advertisements like this? 113,597 doctors from coast to coast were asked about which cigarette do they prefer. And lo and behold, they prefer Camels. That's what they prefer. And of course, you can see here more advertisements about doctors. I like it. The light that never fails, signifying that the light that never fails is tobacco, cigarettes. And of course, you're part of the family, doctor. We can have a cigarette together, which, that doesn't sound like a great idea, having Granny have a cigarette with Doc, but this was the idea. Again, this goes all the way back to the notion that the tobacco company realized that they had a powerful marketing ally when they could pour money into the American Medical Association and advertise in medical journals and be at medical conventions to convince doctors that, hey, smoking was all right. And of course, you can see here more advertisements on the whole smoking. And you can see how, again, talking about how great it is, the T zone will tell you about, how it's great for your mouth and nose. And again, this whole idea, your doctor smokes. And again, this is more about the corruption of it all. This is about the corruption. And this is where we start here, just going through the journals. This was published in March 11, 2004. And this article is written by Richard Horton, who was a former editor of the Lancet. In it, he's reviewing a book by Sheldon Krimsky, who's a physicist, a philosopher from Tufts University School of Medicine. And he talks about the different issues that they have with essentially the buying of medical journals and the control or the monopoly over medical information by large companies who have a vested interest in getting only one type of information out there that supports their products. And he talks about this in the second paragraph. He gives an example, and he makes a point about a physician named David Healy who raised concerns about the risk of suicide among those taking a type of antidepressant. Turns out, after he started raising those risks, before that, he was appointed to the University of Toronto Medical Center for Addiction and Mental Health. As soon as he started raising those questions, his appointment there was revoked. And he points this out. Universities have reinvented themselves as corporations. Scientists are coming to accept, in many cases, enjoy their enhanced status as entrepreneurs. But these subtle yet insidious changes to the rules of engagement between science and commerce are causing, in Krimsky's view, an incalculable injury to society as well as science. In other words, these guys are now the ombudsman of medical truth, and this medical truth needs to be in harmony with the goals of the pharmaceutical industry. Horton continues, and we'll just start the red arrow. He's reviewing Krimsky's book. And so he's going on, and he points out that Krimsky mentions this. And I think this is important because we put so much trust in our FDA or CDC. We put all of our trust in these organizations to keep us safe. We go, surely if there's a problem with it, we'll be helped. They'll take care of us. They'll know what to do. They can't be bought. But indeed, notice what he says here. 1999 U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Government Reform, which concluded that conflict of interest rules on FDA and CDC advisory committees had been weak. Enforcement has been weak. Enforcement has been lax, and committee members with substantial ties to pharmaceutical companies have been given waivers to participate in committee proceedings. So he points out that it is 1999 that the FDA and the CDC advisory committees, they had people appointed who had ties to drug companies, multitude of conflicts of interest, and yet they were still appointed. They got waivers despite all that. And we're supposed to trust in these guys to protect us. And he's pointing out as 1999, they knew this. He goes on to the black arrow. He says, even scientific journals, supposedly the neutral arbiters of quality by virtue of their much vaunted process of critical peer review, are owned by publishers and scientific societies that derive and demand huge earnings from advertising by drug companies and from the sale of commercially valuable content. The pressure on editors to adopt positions that favor these industries is yet another example of the bias that has infiltrated academic exchange. So notice he talks about, because they need to earn money, because of their desire, and think about it, they earn money by taking in advertising dollars and publishing things that would be favorable to drug companies. As of such, you have to ask yourself, what's the motivation then to print or share anything that presents an opposite view? And you would have to say it's very low, if at best. And of course, he was the former editor of Lancet. And he says, as editor of the Lancet, I have attended medical conferences as which I have been urged to publish more favorable views of the pharmaceutical industry. This was back in 2004. You got to imagine this has just only increased even more. Richard Smith, who was the former editor of the British Medical Journal, and he talks about how drug companies are able to manipulate journals, not only in publishing their results and things like that, but their studies that they sponsor. And he's making the point that they're able to create and design studies. They're able to create and design studies that the journals like because they're complex. They have a lot of different moving parts. They have nice graphs. They look nice. I mean, obviously, these guys are spending millions of dollars on them. So journals want to publish these because they seem to be of the highest quality, highest statistically powered. But what he points out is that often these guys who do this, that their studies are written and designed to get the certain results that they want. They're able to get the results because they choose everything. It's not like you have someone independently investigating their products. And what you have is that they set up the study. In other words, they control the rules of the game. If they are a soccer team and they say, we'll play anyone else, but we decide what is offsides. We decide when there needs to be a red card, a yellow card, when there needs to be a penalty kick. You can easily see how they would win the game all the time. And this is indeed what he points out in this. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph so you get an idea, a bit of the flavor of what he's saying. Journals have devolved into information laundering operations for the pharmaceutical industry, wrote Richard Horton. He's quoting Richard Horton, who we just talked about, editor of The Lancet. In March 2004, in the same year, Marcia Agnell, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, lambasted the industry for becoming primarily a marketing machine and co-opting every institution that might stand in its way. Medical journals were conspicuously absent from her list of co-opted institutions, but she and Horton are not the only editors who have become increasingly queasy about the power of influence of the industry. Jerry Cassier, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, argues that the industry has deflected the moral compasses of many physicians. And the editors of the Plus One Medicine have declared that they will not become part of the cycle of dependency between journals and the pharmaceutical industries. Something is clearly up. That's how he starts it. So we talk about this whole peer review process. This is published in May 2005. We talk about this, and we're talking about how important it is and how we can trust these things. And these are former editors of quality journals. And of course, this is Richard Smith, former editor of the British Medical Journal, where they have some serious problems with what is going on. Serious problems. And they're pointing this out years ago. And you have to ask yourself, have things just improved? Or should we just blindly trust what they do today? This is probably the case that woke most of these editors up. This is about Vioxx. And what's fascinating about this was published in the British Medical Journal. What's fascinating about this whole thing was how they were able to manipulate regulators, how they were able to construct the trials, how they were able to hide the risk results of what they were doing. It's amazing everything they did. And in the middle, you can see this quote: Merck selectively targeted doctors who raised questions about the drug, going so far as pressuring some of them through department chairs. In other words, if you disagreed with Merck's analysis on the risks and safety of their drug, Vioxx, they were going to pressure you and perhaps get you demoted or fired from your position. Something you worked your entire life for, that's what they were going to do. And they talk about not only how they did that, but how they manipulated the data, hid studies, hid deaths in their trials in order that they could push this through and get this to people who sadly died. And this was one of the largest lawsuits at this time against a drug manufacturer. And of course, this is later published in 2007, but this happened well before that. And this happened well before that, probably in 1999. And what's fascinating about all this is that people believe that this was a blockbuster, life-saving drug, yet when they finally investigated, they realized it was anything but that. It was a complete and total fraud. In this book, this is Peter Gache. He used to be a former founder of the Cochrane Collaborative, which is kind of the gold standard of medical research. And he devotes in his book, which I do recommend, it is full of footnotes and well cited for all the different things that he says. But he talks about how big pharma is essentially like organized crime. And the reason why he points that out is that he mentions how these guys essentially have crime factored into their profit margin. In other words, that they know that they're going to be hit with fines. They know that they're going to be hit with lawsuits, but they're going to make so much more money than what it's going to cost them that they can just write that off as part of the cost of doing business. And so we were talking about Vioxx, and so he mentions it, and he talks about, he has a whole chapter devoted on it. I'm just going to read a couple excerpts from this. So this is fascinating. In 1996, Merck scientists discussed the heart attack risks, and investigators sponsored by Merck found that Vioxx reduced urinary metabolites of prostacyclin in healthy volunteers by about half, which indicates that Vioxx causes thrombosis. So in other words, they knew that this could cause thrombosis, and thrombosis can lead to heart problems, cardiac arrest, etc. However, Merck convinced the authors to change what they had written into a meaningless sentence. So what they wrote, this is what they wrote. So instead of saying, so this is from his book, instead of saying that Vioxx has the potential to cause clots and heart problems, this is what the scientist wrote under the pressure of the pharmaceutical company. And this is why people didn't think it was that bad. It says the COX-2. So it was a cyclooxygenase 2 blocker. COX-2 may play a role in the systemic biosynthesis of prostacyclin. In other words, instead of saying this can cause clots, this can cause heart attack, cardiac arrest, they said, hey, this just might cause the more biosynthesis of prostacyclin. Amazing. And also, they go back to his book. Also, in 1997, a Merck scientist said that they didn't allow patients to use aspirin in their trials, which decreases the risk of heart attack. Patients on Vioxx might have more heart attacks, and that would kill the drug. So they made sure that people were going to use aspirin during their trials, which their drug was kind of competing with aspirin, so that they could reduce the risk of heart attacks. So they knew from the very beginning that this was going to cause it. And he goes on, he says, the scandal of the COX-2 inhibitors, which is Vioxx, it's what it did, is monumental. The drugs were approved based on small, short-term trials that didn't look for cardiovascular harms. And that sounds awfully familiar. Drugs that were approved based on small, short-term trials. I think I'll get to that in part 2. Anyways, he goes on. He says, in patients, and so notice this, he says, based on small, short-term trials that didn't look for cardiovascular harms in patients with a low risk for such events, although nearly half of real-world patients with arthritis have coexisting cardiovascular disease. This drug, the COX-2 inhibitors, were marketed for people with arthritis. And as the author points out, Peter Gache, that most people who have arthritis have some sort of other risks for heart problems. So in other words, the very drug that they were making could cause heart problems in healthy people, and undoubtedly in the population that they were going to market this drug for, it would actually cause, it was more likely to cause heart attack and problems like that. This is fascinating. So the trial, they have this giant trial called the Vigor Trial. And this Vigor Trial put together all these studies, and it was like the gold standard, and they nicknamed it Vigor, V-I-G-O-R. And they were touting this as the gold standard. And so in this, they did like a meta-analysis of different trials. And so they said Merck did conduct 2 trials. However, trial 90 and the Vigor trial both showed that Vioxx increased cardiovascular events. Trial 90 ended in 1999, but wasn't published until 2006. In other words, they sat on that trial so no one knew that they had indeed found that their drug increased cardiovascular risk. So think about that. It was done in 99. They refused to release it in 2006. 2 years after Vioxx, think about this, 2 years after Vioxx had been withdrawn from the publication and couldn't harm the sales. So the study 90, which showed that there were cardiovascular risks, they waited to publish until 2006. Their drug was taken off the market in 2004. 2004. Think about the corruption that goes on. He goes on. This was kind of eye-opening. He says they talk about they were comparing the study published in 2000 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it compared Vioxx with naproxen. So after in 2001, it says a year later, pharmacist Jennifer Harchovy called a radio show on which the journal's editor Jeffrey Drazen appeared and begged him to correct the paper because there were 3 more heart attacks on Vioxx than on the FDA's website than in the journal article. But Drazen responded evasively. 2 months earlier, Harchovy had sent a letter to the journal, but it was rejected officially because of lack of space, which is an excuse respectable journals cannot hide behind where scientific misconduct relevant for patient safety is suspected. So even the New England Journal of Medicine was informed by a woman who worked on the trials, who was a pharmacist, said, look, this is causing problems. You need to publish something. Here's a letter that I'm writing. Publish that. Warn people. And instead, the journal killed it. It was ignored, and people died. He goes on, the Vigor trial would have looked differently if 3 extra heart attacks had not been deliberately omitted from the trial report. So the giant study that they had, the Vigor trial, which was like the gold standard, everyone was patting themselves on the back of how good of a job they did. This trial, they actually hid 3 heart attacks from. Their inclusion would have undermined the assertion that in the article that only those who were already at high risk of heart attack showed an increased risk after taking Vioxx, as the omitted heart attacks were all in a low risk group. So we can see here that just from one drug, and there's many more. This isn't the only one. There are many other drugs where there are problems, but in this drug, look at what they did. Look how they put it all in peer-reviewed journals. Everyone was applauding it as the gold standard. They did this great research. This was going to be a groundbreaking drug. And instead, they hid the data that showed it was dangerous and lethal to some people. For what reason? For money. I love this article. This is from the New York Times. This is March 3, 2009. And what's fascinating about this article is that the medical students of Harvard were upset that their professors, their clinical advisors, all these people had all sorts of undisclosed relationships with the drug companies. In other words, their entire education was being subsidized by the drug companies, and they would hear lectures on the benefits of cholesterol drugs. They would hear lectures on the benefit of all these different drugs. Their whole education, they were being trained to trust in the drugs, not question them, and told how they're scientific and how you have to do all this. And you begin to wonder when you see certain websites where they're trashing anyone who downs drugs, you begin to wonder, well, wasn't your education completely subsidized by the drug companies? And this is New York Times, which is not an anti-drug, anti-vaccine, or anything type of publication. As a matter of fact, it pretty much stands for the status quo. And yet even they had to point this out, that the people teaching our future physicians are receiving money and peddling the products of these pharmaceutical companies. They're receiving money from them and peddling their products to future doctors. This is why our doctors often have a hard time questioning drugs, because their whole entire education has been made They've been made to believe that these things are great and effective. This is another article. This is written by David Klemper, and this is in the German International Medicine Journal. And you can see what he says here. He says, there is no secret to how the desired results are fabricated. He's talking about what the drug companies do to get the results they want when it comes to their research. He says, there is no secret to how the desired results are fabricated. It is possible to give a study a spin into the desired direction at any stage of the research process. The results will differ according to what the research question is. Which of the possible endpoints are included? Which patients are included or excluded? What is being compared? And which study period is selected? In the evaluation, it is common practice to change primary and secondary endpoints without disclosure, suppressing results that might constitute an obstacle to marketing a substance, as well as the reinterpretation of a negative and unclear results as positive results, are further methods of manipulations. Pharmaceutical companies often leave both doctors and patients in the dark about the real effects of their products. The knowledge base on which we as doctors reach decisions with our patients is often distorted, and doctors thus often unwittingly put their patients at risk. And this, of course, was published in 2010. Now, is he wrong? Are these things still happening? Do drug companies continue to change their endpoints? Do they throw out certain data points, add in certain data points, try to interpret them differently? Are these things so? And the answer is yes, yes, and yes. And yet we are told, well, this is just science. We have to follow the science. We have to. And here's the thing. I'm not saying that we need to liquidate all medical journals and to ignore them. No. But what I am saying is that if there are certain drugs or products that are written by the drug companies, funded by the drug companies, and they get the results that are favorable to the drug companies, we should back up and ask some real tough questions. And perhaps we should allow people to have the freedom to choose whether they want these drugs in their body or not. Moreover, it would be nice that more doctors in their training knew that their teachers, their professors, their clinical advisors, their attending physicians, whether or not they're actually sponsored by drug companies, so they could take whatever advice they have to say with a healthy dose of salt. Here's another journal article, and this is the European Journal of Clinical Investigation. And you can see here what they say. This is their conclusion, and they talk about the manipulation of data. They talk about how they're able to use their money and their influence to spin things to get what they want. And again, all these people are writing this because they see what the drug companies are doing. They understand how they are manipulating people to think that their products are always safe and effective and that we must trust them. It says, to serve its interest, the industry masterfully influences evidence-based production, evidence synthesis, understanding of harms issues, cost effectiveness evaluations, clinical practice guidelines, and healthcare professional education, and also exerts direct influence on professional decisions and health consumers. Now, that's an awful lot. But what he's saying, that every single step at evaluating these drugs, whether it be the evidence, whether it be the evidence of the journals, the peer-reviewed journals, the trials, they influence. Whether it be the meta-analysis where they're looking at all the different things, they influence. Whether it be the actual harm that comes to people from taking their drugs, they influence. Whether this drug is cost effective, they influence. And the practice guidelines. So there's different organizations out there that provide practice guidelines to different doctors, whether it be the American Heart Association, American Family Physicians, the American Medical Association. There are other groups, American Gastroenterologists Society, wherever they are, American Cancer Society, all these different organizations will write at times guidelines for the standard of care to tell doctors how they should treat patients. And what happens is that there are drug companies in their ear saying, well, can you talk about this, and influencing them. So when doctors get these clinical guidelines, they think, well, these guys are much smarter than me. I'm going to do what they said. And again, he's pointing this out, that this is the subtle influence, and it's multifaceted at very different levels, and they're doing it all the time. And yet we're just told, hey, you got to trust the science. And yet these guys are pointing out that the science can be co-opted at all these different levels. This is another art. This is an article by Peter Garcia, and this is talking about. This is published in the Polish Archives of Internal Medicine, and this is talking about the prescription drugs and how they kill over 200,000 people a year. And he looked at the data, and he determined that over 200,000 people die every year from taking the drugs as prescribed, taking prescription drugs. 100,000 die taking the drugs as prescribed. Either they die because there's a drug-to-drug interaction that someone didn't recognize. They die because they took too much of the drug. The dose that was given to them was too high. And then there's others that die for not taking the prescription drugs as indicated. Too much of a dose, too little of a dose. They don't take them as indicated, but nonetheless, he calculates that this would normally be the third leading cause of death, killing over 200,000 people every year in the United States. And so he talks about this, and this is what he says. He was investigating this, and this goes over here, and it says, in 2010, a jury found that the world's largest drug company, Pfizer, had violated the Organized Crime Act and had engaged in racketeering conspiracy over a 10-year period. So just so you understand this case was taken before a jury in court, and the evidence was presented, and they said that Pfizer had acted like a corrupt, organized crime family and what it was doing. And they had engaged in all these different bribery, all this other stuff. And he goes on, he says, the other large drug companies have committed similar fines as Pfizer, but they have settled, thereby avoiding a possible verdict of organized crime. Incredible. Many of the crimes that have involved psychiatric drugs and bribery of psychiatrists and pervasive illegal promotion of these drugs have carried a terrible death toll. I have estimated, based on the sales to a meta-analysis of randomized trials of antipsychotics, that showed that the risk of death was twice as high on the drug as on the placebo. That just one antipsychotic drug, olanzapine, has killed over 200,000 people. The newer antidepressant drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, also led to many deaths. So he's talking about these companies have created a business model where they make money, even if they get fined, even if they have to settle criminal penalties. No matter what happens, they're making money. So will they continue to bribe? Will they continue to use their influence? And the answer is yes, yes, and yes. And yeah, that was in 2010 that the jury did that to Pfizer. This was published in 2014. But again, we would have to be quite naive to think that this just stopped. These guys learned their lessons. They've had a moment. They've repented and been baptized, and they've changed. But the answer is no, they have not. This article was published in 2015, and this article is about Restoring Study 329. So there was a big issue about diagnosing children with anxiety disorder and treating them using the drugs paroxetine, known as Paxil, and imiprim. And I forget the generic or the common name of it. But either way, both of these drugs were for that. And here's the thing, that when those drugs came out, they were never tested on kids or adolescents. They were never tested on them. So when they were wanting to get this approved for adolescents, teenagers, they had to demonstrate that these things were safe and effective. And so they published a bunch of trials saying that these drugs were safe and effective. Well, what happened is that it turned out that there were a lot of young children, adolescents and teenagers, dying from these drugs. Some would commit suicide trying to get off the drugs. Some would commit suicide on the drugs. They had all kinds of problems. And so as these lawsuits began to amount, people began to say, well, where did we go wrong? We were told these things were safe and effective. And the drug companies stonewalled and said, these things are safe and effective. They don't hurt anyone. These are just parents looking for money. They're just upset that their child hung themselves in the garage. They're just trying to blame someone. And we just happen to be the deep pocket person. How dare they do this to us? And this is what they did. Well, unfortunately for them, a group of investigators got together and they filed a Freedom of Information Act request where they were able to get a study. And the study was known as 329. And what they decided to do is they went back and they looked at the study and they followed the protocol that these companies said they were going to do. They followed their protocols, they ran statistical analysis, and it ended up being the exact opposite of what the drug company was telling regulators. Here's it is. So they were telling the regulators that these drugs were safe and effective. And you can see the different drugs here. You can see that in comparing to a placebo. If you look at the curve where it shows that the level of anxiety that they have starts off at the very top at day 0 and how the scores improve. If you look at the different dots, the green is for Paxil, the white is for Imiprime, and the blue is for the placebo. And if you look, there's almost no difference. You see the blue next to the white, next to the green. There's no statistical difference between the efficacy of those drugs and the placebo. None of it. And if you look at the other graph, they again look at how the children responded to it, and you look at again the placebo, which is the dark blue, Imiprime, the light blue, and paroxetine white, and you look at it and not much difference. No statistical difference between the substances. No statistical difference. What made this worse is that even if the drug that they were giving had no statistical significance in its efficacy, it was actually dangerous. And so this is again from the article. It says, reporting adverse events. Our reanalysis of study 329 showed considerable variations in the way adverse events can be reported, demonstrating several ways in which the analysis and presentation of safety data can influence the apparent safety of a drug. We identified the following potential barriers to accurate reporting of harms summarized in box 2. So what these guys did is that when bad things would happen, they would actually write it differently. They would write it in a way so that you wouldn't understand. So this is what they said. The term emotional lability used and this is a SmithKline Beecham's adverse drug event coding system masks differences in suicidal behavior between paroxetine and the placebo. In other words, instead of saying that these guys, these participants in the trial had suicidal behavior, they would change the term, calling it emotional lability. In other words, they were just up, they were down, they were unstable. What was obvious, suicidal behavior, was masked using a different system. And then they mentioned this, they failure to transcribe all adverse events from clinical record to adverse event databases. They didn't even report all the things. Our review of case report forms disclosed significant under recording of adverse events. So they slow rolled, didn't want people to find out the adverse events, so they just barely recorded them. And then when there were still too many, they changed the name of the adverse events in the system, the symptoms, so that people wouldn't know. You could see it. They changed it. So you look at this and you're like, well, how is it that people could trust it? And this went on for years. This study was hidden. It took a Freedom of Information Act request to get this study. It's crazy just to think about it. And how many children committed suicide and had all sorts of problems because they were put on these drugs because regulators were told safe and effective. And it's not effective. And clearly, they were hiding the fact that it wasn't safe. Here's the next one. Potential barriers to accurate reporting of harms. This is in their graph. It talks about the use of an idiosyncratic coding system. In other words, they call symptoms and things whatever they want to hide what they actually were. Failure to transcribe all adverse events from clinical record to adverse event database. Not reporting them. Filtering data on adverse events through statistical techniques. That's right. Leave some in, leave some out, try to get rid of them. Restriction of reporting to events that occurred above a given frequency in any one group. That's right. So if something happened too much, they just said, that's not important. Well, that's just an outlier. Coding event under different headings for different patients. That's right. Again, diluting what was happening. Grouping of adverse events. That's right. That way you could, instead of saying it was widespread among different patients, they just grouped them. Insufficient consideration of severity. Oh, well, it's almost like saying, little Bobby, he took a knife and cut his wrist, but kids, they do those things. I mean, this is what they did. Coding of relatedness of study medication. Again, they began to disassociate these events with their medication. Masking effects of concomitant drugs. Yeah, not looking at the side effects of what they were giving and how it was being used, and ignoring effects of drug withdrawal. That's right. Sometimes they argue that coming off these drugs is sometimes worse than being on it. And when they tried to take these children off the drugs, they said, man, we don't know what's happening. That looks really bad, but it's not related to what we're doing. Again, this is terrible, but this is what they did. Looking back, this is what they said. The principal findings in comparison with original data publication. So this is their analysis. Our rate analysis of study 329 showed that neither paroxetine nor high-dose imiprene was effective in the treatment of major depression in adolescents. And there was a clinically significant increase in the harms with both drugs. This analysis contrasts with both the published conclusions of Keller and colleagues and the way that the outcomes were reported and interpreted in the CSR. In other words, when the regulators looked at it, and even the authors, when they looked at this, their conclusion is entirely different in contrast. It's like night and day. They said it was safe and effective, and they find that it is neither effective nor safe. How can this be? Because there's a lot of money to be made with these drugs. Here's their conclusion. Contrary to the original report by Keller and colleagues, our analysis of study 329 showed no advantage of paroxetine or imiprene over placebo in adolescents with symptoms of depression on any of the pre-specified variables. That's right. When they stuck with their original trial design, because they had to change it over and over again to get the results they want. When these guys looked at their original trial design, looking at their pre-specified variables to see what would happen, they found no effectiveness. The extent of the clinically significant increases in adverse events in the paroxetine and imiprene arms include serious, severe, and suicide-related adverse events became apparent only when the data were made available for reanalysis. That's right. Nobody knew about this until they were able to reanalyze the data. Once they were able to reanalyze the data, they were like, oh my gosh, look how terrible this drug was. Researchers and clinicians should recognize the potential biases in published research, including the potential barriers to accurate reporting of harms that we have identified. Regulatory authorities should mandate accessibility of data and protocols. In other words, more transparency. Now, I love this part. I love this next part, but I just want to help you to understand this. These were drugs that they were giving children that were neither safe nor effective because so much money was riding on this. And could it be that these people were bribed? Could it be that drug company money was all over the place, influencing the universities, influencing the people overseeing the trial? Could it be that they had connections there? We don't know. But what we do know is that they hid their results, which were the exact opposite of the conclusion that was favorable to the drug companies and the authors working on this. And this is what I love about the second part. Notice what they say is, as with most scientific papers, Keller and colleagues convey an impression that the data have spoken. This authoritative stance is possible only in the absence of access to the data. When the data becomes accessible to others, it becomes clear that the scientific authorship is provisional rather than authoritative. In other words, when Keller and his colleagues published their article talking about the safety and efficacy of these drugs, they're like, "Thus saith the science." And the only reason why they could say that is because their entire data, their entire study was a fraud. And when someone else is able to examine it, they realize, oh my goodness, what you did was a fraud, and yet you stood and pontificated as if what you were giving children was safe and effective. This is why there should always be more transparency, not less. This is why researchers and clinicians should have access to the data on every drug that is going to go into anyone, so that people can make what we call informed decisions and have informed consent. But if you don't do this, you can't possibly have informed consent, because sometimes neither the doctor nor the patient actually knows their risks or benefits. And clearly the risks and benefits were completely outside of the realms of possibility or plausibility for children when it came to these drugs. It's important to note this, that both imiprene and paroxetine to this day, here's paroxetine, here's imiprene, to this day, bear a black box warning label put there by the FDA talking about suicides. This happened because people sued and were able to get the data. They had to point this out. It took a number of deaths before the drug companies were forced to put this warning on there. And sadly, doctors still give this stuff to adolescents, because why? Their entire education has been subsidized by the drug companies. Their clinical guidelines are influenced by the drug companies. The advertisements that they see in medical journals are influenced by drug companies. And the data itself is often put there that is written, designed, and benefits the drug companies in these journals. This is the system that we're in, and we put so much trust in it. This is why we must critically look at everything and question to see if these things are so. Here's another study published here. And this, of course, this one hits home because I have known people, I've had family members who've gotten addicted to opioids. And this is quite sad. This was published in 2018, and this is after the large lawsuit against, 2017. This was after the large lawsuit against Purdue and how they were responsible for all these deaths and people's lives completely destroyed for getting on these opioids. And what they found in this article, they talk about, this was ironically published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but the lawyers in this talk about this lawsuit, and they mentioned how there was data which showed that Purdue knew that their products were highly addictive, and they told doctors that they weren't. They said, hey, it's safe and effective, It's not going to hurt anyone. It knocks out pain, no big deal. And again, these opioids were synthetic forms of what we get, morphine, and morphine's highly addictive, but somehow they thought that they had got the kinks out of morphine and it was no longer going to be addictive. And yet they were wrong. And indeed, opioids are addictive. And now lives have been ruined. And even though it says, notwithstanding the $600 million federal settlement with Purdue in 2007, one of the largest in history with a drug company, opioid litigation has yet to financially dent the $13 billion a year opioid industry. 13 billion. In other words, they could lie to regulators. They could lie to physicians. They could put out all their drug reps and well fund them, give them wonderful salaries and tell them, you got to push this drug. And as this drug got pushed, lives were completely ruined. Ruined. There are people who are dead who will not see $1 from these lawsuits. There are people whose lives are completely destroyed, lost their father, lost their mother, lost their daughter, lost their son for doing nothing illegal except for filling a prescription bottle at a pharmacy and taking it as prescribed and became addicts. I've met people who were in jail for heroin because they started off with opioids and they found out that heroin was cheaper than opioids. This is what we've done. We've put so much trust in them. And they've shown us over and over. This is just a small sample size of the corruption that is in the pharmaceutical industry. And again, the question is why do we trust them so much? Why do we trust them so much? Shouldn't we trust something else? Shouldn't we put our trust in the Lord? I think we should. I think we should question these things. I think messages that told us not to put our confidence in drugs are quite valuable. Now, there is a part 2 to this, and this part 2 will only be on Rumble. So if you're enjoying this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, but you want to see part 2, it will be on Rumble. We hope you were blessed by this presentation. We thank you for tuning in, and as always, Godspeed.